And so these individuals were moved, but they weren't moved properly or appropriately, according to the provisions of the Fair Housing Act, correct?
That's correct. So conditions in their buildings have become so unlivable that the residents came together and organized to push HUD to cancel their slumlords subsidy contracts and give them vouchers to allow them to move. But then what HUD did was HUD selected contractors, including the Hartford Housing Authority, that didn't know how to give people a range of options for where to move that would include suburban areas outside of Hartford, and also gave people way too little time to find new housing. So instead of residents having a real choice about where to move and some being able to decide that they wanted to stay in the neighborhood in the north end of Hartford, and that was, you know, where their sort of connection to family and, you know, religious congregations and their roots are, but others might want to move to a different, you know, suburban community that had a different school district or is closer to their job at like a, you know, a hospital or a shopping mall. That choice is taken away essentially because with the parameters that HUD put in place and these local actors sort of reinforced, there weren't choices outside of the city of Hartford in a meaningful way for residents as they tried to relocate.
How many families are we talking about?
So we're talking about three different developments, all located within about a 2-mile radius of each other in the north end of Hartford. And the number of families overall is not at the tip of my tongue, but it's a few hundred overall.
Right, but that's fine. I just want to get a sense. We're talking about buildings.
Yes, we're talking about buildings.
We're not talking about just a handful of people.
Yes.
So let me get this straight. HUD contracted with someone that did not inform the families of what their real options were, correct?
That's correct. HUD chose you know, local agencies that didn't tell families about options to move outside of the city of Hartford, didn't tell families how much their voucher would pay for outside of the city of Hartford, and also didn't give families enough time to meaningfully look for options outside of the city of Hartford. So, you know, if you're trying to move, you know, there's so many barriers that, you know, a low-income Black or Latinx family in Hartford faces in trying to move anywhere other than the neighborhoods that people have historically been segregated into through government action. And if you want to try to break down those barriers and increase the range of choices for where people can move, it takes more time. And they were simply denied that additional time.
Yeah. So there's the issue of mobility counseling, correct?
Yes.
So in the Fair Housing Act and in the legislation, that is provided for. That's a guarantee.
So the Fair Housing Act doesn't speak directly to mobility counseling. What the Fair Housing Act says is that HUD, as well as any other federal agency that administers housing programs, that could be the VA or the Department of Agriculture in rural areas, has a duty to affirmatively further fair housing, which is a term you used when you were sort of introducing my background. And that means that for HUD, it's not just enough to not discriminate. You know, HUD is held to a higher standard, and what HUD has to do is actually take affirmative, proactive steps to dismantle the state-sanctioned segregation that HUD's predecessor agencies helped create before the Fair Housing Act was enacted. And we believe that one of those key proactive steps that HUD really needs to be taking in this type of situation is providing mobility counseling.
Mm-hmm. And there was also the issue of, you mentioned the deadlines.
Mm-hmm.
Those were not realistic
mm-hmm.
for people to be able to relocate, correct?
That's correct, because, you know, it takes longer if you're trying to use a voucher to move to a white suburb, and you know all of the discrimination that folks are going to face, and all of the barriers that folks are going to face, and the challenges in transportation in getting out there to tour different properties. It's going to take longer to have a search for a new home that includes those areas than one where you're looking in a sort of narrower radius right around where you currently live.
So how much time were these families given, Thomas?
In general, they were given 120 days, which is really, really challenging to do this kind of search in that amount of time. That's made even more difficult and more complicated by the fact that all the folks from these buildings are moving at the same time. So, usually when people are issued vouchers to move it, with someone coming off of the Section 8 waiting list and getting a voucher for the first time, it's not a whole bunch of people getting a voucher and trying to move at the same time. It's sort of a sort of gradual turnover of people who have this type of assistance. But if you're trying to relocate hundreds of families at the same time, or even dozens of families at the same time, in an area where there may not be a huge number of vacancies, that actually makes it take longer as well. So it was about 120 days as an initial matter. And then there were instances where the deadline was extended, but there's a real difference between having a realistic deadline to begin with and having an unrealistic deadline that's then extended, because you can't plan around extensions. You can't, and it sort of drives folks into panic mode.
Yeah. And so this 120 days, Thomas, when did it occur? Is this a recent 120 days?
So as I mentioned earlier, there were 3 specific developments in Hartford that had these conditions and where the residents were given vouchers. And the relocation processes happened in a somewhat staggered way. So everyone from each building was being relocated at the same time. But the first building, the relocation process was happening around 2 years ago.
Okay.
And then for the subsequent 2 buildings, it was mostly in 2019. So generally speaking, sort of 2018 and 2019 is when most of the relocation activity was occurring.
And so where have these families ended up today?
So a hugely disproportionate portion of the families have ended up back in the city of Hartford, oftentimes back in the north end of the city of Hartford, which is the most heavily Black and Latinx part of the city. And struggling with the real legacy of decades of disinvestment, to the extent that folks were able to move outside of the city. Oftentimes the places they were able to move to weren't the sort of kind of exclusionary white suburbs that for decades have erected these sort of barriers to people moving in. It was some of the relatively few more diverse working class suburbs, places like East Hartford, Connecticut, New Britain, Manchester. Meanwhile, you've got places like Simsbury and Glastonbury and Avon and all these sort of overwhelmingly white suburbs that kind of have been engaged in what we sometimes call opportunity hoarding over the decades, which is where you've got these metropolitan areas, got these regions that are carved up into so many different municipalities. And there are places, often predominantly white, affluent areas that have a lot of property tax base, and they keep their resources, their high performing public schools, their parks to themselves. They hoard those resources in order to not more equitably share access to opportunity for everyone who lives in a given region like Greater Hartford. Yeah.
So they moved from segregated Hartford to outside of Hartford and was still pretty much segregated, correct?
Yeah. So most would have just been moving within Hartford, and
Right.
narrow exceptions to the rule where folks are moving outside of Hartford were mostly moving to areas that were maybe not quite as segregated as Hartford, but are not the areas that HUD should be taking really concerted action to make available.
Yeah. The term you use, I want to get it right. Did you say opportunity hoarding? Is that
opportunity hoarding?
Right. So does HUD, vis-a-vis the Fair Housing Act, have the authority and ability to relocate people and give them vouchers into some of these opportunity hoarded areas? They can do that, right?
Absolutely. So, of course, at the end of the day, the choice as to where an individual family lives is always needs to reside with the individual. But right. Can break down the barriers that make it harder much harder and sometimes practically impossible to move to some of these opportunity hoarding areas. So HUD can, when you get a voucher, historically the way it would work is, say you got a voucher for a 2-bedroom unit, and the HUD and the housing authority, if you're in New York City, NYCHA would say your 2-bedroom voucher is worth such and such amount. But HUD has authority to make changes to make that amount more realistic. So one thing that's historically been a problem is that the amount that the voucher would pay for wouldn't be enough in, say, Glastonbury, Connecticut. And HUD has authority to influence that. HUD has authority to change that. HUD has the authority to pick a contractor to carry out its relocation that has a proven track record of administering vouchers across cities and towns within a metro area. And they didn't do that. There actually is a Connecticut state agency, the Connecticut Department of Housing, has a voucher program that operates across this whole metro area. HUD specifically chose not to use them for this and to use the Hartford Housing Authority's program, which only focuses on the city of Hartford instead. Similarly, you've got all of the sort of the barriers that people face that mobility counseling can help break down, whether it's, credit checks or criminal background screening, or just, excessive security deposit requirements and all of this stuff. Mobility counseling can help break down those barriers. Mobility counseling can help, inform people about opportunities they may not have been aware existed. And HUD can meaningfully provide for that, and they didn't. HUD, in this case, chose a contractor to help advise families on the relocation process, called Loomis, which is one of the the sort of antagonists in this lawsuit. And that they chose someone who had no experience providing mobility counseling, whereas there are plenty of folks around the country who know how to do it because it's been done. There's a proven track record.